Nítido, ahora sí estoy de vuelta, creo que ya correctamente. Nítido, ya publicamos en todos los lugares donde debía hacerse la publicación. Vamos a hacer las redes sociales, donde estamos por el momento. Bien. Esto y esto también. Estamos. Ok, espero que la música se escuche no demasiado fuerte. Veamos, mi voz debería escucharse por encima. Nítido, yo creo que ahora vamos a dejar ahí la música, nítido. Pero en el chat hay algo que diga que si no se escucha bien la música, voy a estar revisando cada poco. Bueno, pues continuamos con el curso donde nos quedamos. Nos tocan audio y haptics. ¿Cómo se traduce haptics en español? ¿Hápticos? Nítido. Veamos.
Imagine you're in a rainforest. All 5 of your senses, what you can see, hear, touch, taste, and smell, all come together to tell your brain that you really are in a rainforest. Well, if the goal in VR is a sense of presence, we're not doing very well right now, because we're only really tapping into one of our senses. We're going to triple that number by adding 2 more senses to our experience. By the end of this lesson, you'll add effects for touch and sound to your VR scene. In real life, when you touch or grab something, you feel a sensation in your hand. So in VR, when you touch or grab something, your brain expects a sensation from your hand. Simulating touch, also called haptics, can be done with vibrations from your controllers. Maybe some very subtle vibration when you hover over something to simulate touching it, and then a stronger vibration to simulate grabbing it. A little bit of haptic feedback goes a long way to improving immersion. The next sense we'll turn to is hearing, or audio. Without sound, an environment feels dead, stagnant, unnerving. Just a simple crackling of a fire, or a bird chirping outside of your window, or even the faint hum of a refrigerator goes a long way to bringing your scene to life. This is especially true in VR, where the audio responds to the slightest movement of your head. The way it gets louder or quieter in your ear depending on where you are relative to the source just makes it seem so real. Combine that audio with some haptic feedback and you've got the ingredients for immersive VR. So, to make all of that happen, I'll see you in Unity.
Aquí vamos a mandar esto a pantalla en pantalla.
So now we have all of these interactable objects inside of our scene. Here I can grab the tennis.
Vamos a hacer algo. Vamos a mandar esto aquí hacia la izquierda. Vamos a poner... No, esta no. Ay, esto no. Unity vamos a poner aquí a la derecha. Izquierda. Así va a ser. Vamos a hacer esto más chiquito. Voy a cerrar la pestaña aquí. Nítido.
Track it, I can grab the hat off this hook. But we're gonna add a little bit more features to help out our user here. So you can see when I hover over the hat, for example, my ray turns from red to white. But now we're gonna add in some haptic feedback so that our controllers actually give us some kind of notification when we hover over something or even grab it. Now, there's a specific kind of event that we can make happen called haptic feedback, where essentially we can make our controllers vibrate much like you would with a normal controller if you're playing a video game, for example. And so we're gonna add in some of that into our actual controllers. And to do that, I'll need to head over to my XR rig. So if I go to where my XR objects, here you can see in the XR rig, we're gonna go all the way down to our controllers. Now in our controllers, if you remember, we played around with some of these settings, but now we're gonna head over to the XR Ray Interactor component. Now there's actually several different kinds of events that we can set off. We have audio events, we have haptic events, and we have interactor events. For now, we're gonna focus on the haptic events to actually get that feedback when we're hovering over an object and when we grab it with our hands. You might notice haptic feedback when you're typing on your smartphone, for example, and you might notice that there's like a really light vibration that happens when you're pressing on your keypad. It's these really small, different feedback events that help you feel a bit more physical experience when you're touching your touchscreen. In our case, we're gonna do this when we're using our controllers on our headset. And you can see there's a couple of different options here. You can actually see on select entered is already checkmarked. However, there's no intensity for that actual vibration that happens. And there's no duration, so it doesn't actually happen. It doesn't do anything. We can even set different events for when we exit our grab, when we hover over something on hover entered, or when we stop hovering over something on hover exited. So for now, we're gonna stick with on select entered and on hover entered. And I'm gonna do some testing with on hover entered here. Now we want a pretty light vibration coming from our controllers when we hover over something. I'm gonna set the haptic intensity to a 0.1 and we'll see how that feels. And you could also use this slider too if you wanted to change the values, but I like to type in the values on occasion. And for duration, this is the amount of time in seconds. So you probably want it to be something pretty short. If you make the duration something like 25 seconds, that's just far too long. Your controller will just constantly be vibrating, especially if you have all these different objects in your scene. So we want something that's really light, really fast, so that we know when we're hovering over something. So I'm going to try a duration of 0.1, so that's 1/10 of a second, so it'll be really quick.
Okay.
So let's see what that's like in our scene in VR.
Okay, bueno, carguemos nuestro casco de realidad virtual. Reconoció y aparece debajo del suelo otra vez. Ahora sí debería aparecer en el lugar correcto. Traigamos los controles. A ver, veamos. Vamos a probar de nuevo, solo que vamos a dar esto a maximizar para que ustedes también puedan ver lo que yo estoy viendo, o por lo menos más o menos lo que estoy viendo. A ver. Ok, vibra. Entonces, esto espero que ustedes no pueden verlo. Sí, ya vibra. Yo sí puedo hacer que ustedes puedan escucharlo, a ver. Esto acá, micrófono acá, acá. Si me acerco aquí, acá. Ahí. Ahí. Ya, esto funciona, está nítido. Play. Y sigamos escuchando. Cambiemos el audio a... No, ya sé, voy a duplicar el audio en SteamVR. Recuerdo que eso es... ¡No, eso no! Eso no era. Esto no era, esto estaba bien. En configuración, en audio, duplicado de audio activo y lo vamos a mandar a headphones. Si estoy en lo correcto, ustedes todavía deberían poder seguir escuchando el audio.
All right, so if I hover over my tennis racket here, there's like a really quick light vibration that happens in my controller. But it's not happening in my right controller because I didn't properly set that up. I'll show you a nice quick way that we can do that after this. But that is very helpful to know when I'm actually hovering over something. So there's just a little bit of vibration that comes from my controller. So, in fact, we can edit both our left and right hand controller at the same time by control clicking on left and right, or you can just shift click both of them. That's pretty easy since they're right next to each other. You can see here that haptic events has changed because we actually have two different settings on our controllers right now. So what I could do is uncheck on hover entered, that way it's the same on both of them. And then when I check on hover entered, now we can actually change these settings. So this was 0.1 and the duration was also 0.1. Now when we actually grab something, we probably want something a bit more intense. So I'm gonna try something like 0.5 so we get a stronger vibration. And I'm gonna increase the duration just a little bit so that we know when we actually grab something. So I'll try something like 0.25 for now. So that's a quarter of a second. Now we can double check to make sure that this is right on both. This is always just a nice thing to do. So you can see actually on left hand, that setting was set properly, but on right hand, it was not. That's because I didn't make sure that both of the boxes were on check marks. If you notice, there was a little line going through on select entered, but that's okay. We can check mark that and it actually saves the settings, which is very helpful so that we don't have to enter them again.
Okay.
So let's see what that's like in VR with our on select entered. Okay, so in our VR world here, let me take a look at the tennis racket again. So I have the different pieces of feedback happening when I'm hovering over with both left and right, which is good. So let's try grabbing this tennis racket. And there was a much longer vibration that happened there. Let's see if I grab this hat. And there was another vibration that happened when I picked it up. So haptic feedback, a very helpful way to know when you're hovering over things and when you grab something to let your user know that they actually have something in their hands. So what you're gonna do is in your project, go to where your XR rig is, and you can shift click both your left and right hand controllers. That way you have them both selected. And then what you're gonna do is head down to your XR Ray Interactor component, where you're gonna check mark on select entered and on hover entered. And for on hover entered, you're gonna set a small duration and a light haptic intensity for a little bit of feedback for your user. But when they actually grab something, on select entered, set the duration to a little bit longer and the haptic intensity just a bit higher, so then that way you know when you've actually grabbed something. So now it's your turn.
Okay, thank you. Ok, tenemos resuelta la parte de las vibraciones. Veamos lo siguiente. Es el primero, ok. Audio feedback, ok. Veamos cómo es eso.
Now that we've enabled haptic feedback for our controllers, we can know when we actually hover over an object and also when we grab an object. Now, a nice thing that we can do on top of that is adding in some audio feedback to let us know when we've grabbed an object as well.
Vamos a guardar esto en GitHub. Add general objects.
Well, so let's add some audio events in to let our players know when they've grabbed something.
Okay.
So to add in those audio events, we're just gonna go back to our XR rig and check out both of our controllers. Now, as a helpful reminder from the last step, if you just shift click on both of the controllers, we can edit the properties at the same time. And if you remember, we have that audio events property on our XR Ray interactor. So if we expand that, you'll see that there's similar options to the haptic events. But in this case, we're only going to add in an audio event on select entered. We could do on hover entered, however, that might get a little annoying if you start hovering over a bunch of things. You'll just have a sound playing all the time, versus we want our player to really know when they've grabbed something. Now you can see when we checkmarked that on select entered property, it now asks us for an audio clip. And fortunately, we've provided a bunch of audio clips for you to use inside of the course library. So if I head down to the project window here, we'll go into the course library folder. And you'll see there's already an audio folder, so let's head over there. We have two options for sound effects and for music, so let's check out the sound effects. And you can see there's a lot of different options for sound that we can add in. It's a little hard to read though, so something you could do is in the project window, this little slider at the bottom here, you can actually slide all the way to the left and it will make your icon super tiny to the point where they're just the names. So that might make it a little bit easier to see all of the different options we have.
Okay.
So if we want to preview any of these sound effects, we can just click one at random, maybe this machine power up. Let's see how that sounds. And to actually preview the clip, you can just drag up this little bar down here that says SFX machine power up. So this is actually a preview bar. And you can see it actually has the sound waves as well as a play button so you can hear what it sounds like. So if I press this play button here, you can hear a nice little machine power-up sound that we have. So you can use this as a way to test out different sounds if you want to see how they actually sound like. Now, we have some options here. We have UI button. You can see what that sounds like. Okay, we also have UI clicks. Let's see how that sounds. Okay, we have a few different options. I do kind of like that sound. So I'll try using that for my left and right hand controllers. So in order to add the sound, I just have to make sure I mass select the left and right hand controller. So I'll click on left hand, shift, left click on right hand. You could also use control click and click each different option too. Now in audio clip to play, I'll just drag and drop UI click 3 into that property. And now when I head into VR, I should be able to hear this sound when I grab something. So if I check out one of my objects here, let's try the tennis racket. So if I grab it, I should hear that click sound. Yep, that seems to work. Let's try the hat. Cool. So that's a nice little bit of audio feedback to go along with our haptic feedback. So what you're gonna do is head over to your XR rig once again and mass select the left and right hand controllers. Down in the XR Ray interactor, you can expand the audio events dropdown and checkmark on select entered. Next, you're going to find an audio clip to play, which you can find inside of your course library folder, in the audio folder, in FX. From there, you can see the different sound effects that we've added into the project that you can add to your left and right hand controller. In my case, I went with SFX UI Click 3. And if you wanted to preview the sound effects, make sure that this bar is expanded here, so you can actually just drag it up if it's at the bottom here. Press the play button to hear the sound. And then to add the sound effect to your controllers, just select your controllers once again. Go down to your XR Ray interactor, and then just drag and drop the audio clip into audio clip to play. So now it's your turn.
Vamos al siguiente. Add 3D audio for Fireplace. A ver si vamos a poner algo más por aquí. Un chatito, no.
Now we've added in a bunch of noises into our world for when we grab different objects. And this is something called non-diegetic sound. So this is sound that doesn't actually originate from the world itself. That might be something that's a little confusing to understand. You can think of it as something like a filler noise. So in this case, it's the sound that is created when we grab an object to just let our user know that something happened. However, we want to add in some actual life into our world. We want to add in something called diegetic sound so that different things like our fireplace in the corner over here, maybe our TV, or even outside, we can hear noises that make this room come alive. So let's get started by adding in some sounds for our scene. Now, the simplest sound that would probably be the most relaxing would be adding in a crackling fireplace for our actual fireplace here. So I'm going to select my fireplace object in my scene. And you can see we have this big object here, but in particular, we're going to be playing around with 3D sound. So it will actually emanate from a specific point inside our fireplace. Now, usually the sound of a crackling fire comes from the actual wood that's burning, for example. And so inside of here, you can see there's a couple of things. We actually have some lights as well as a particle effect. So I'm going to use the particle effect that we have and actually add in an audio source here where the sound is going to come from. So with the particle selected, I'm gonna go add a component and we're gonna look for audio and specifically an audio source. So this component here is gonna look for an audio clip to use to then create a sound for this fireplace. If we head over to our course library folder, in the audio folder, we have effects. And then inside of effects, we can see what different audio options we have. And there's actually a loop for a fire here. So if I wanted to preview that sound, let me make sure I have the preview window open. And let's just hear how it sounds. Sounds pretty good. You can hear the fire roaring, you can hear things crackling in the background, so I think this will be a good source to use. So if I go back to my particle where I have the audio source, I'll add in the fire loop onto the audio clip. Now there's a couple of other settings that we want to pay attention to. In particular, we want to make sure that we have play on awake selected, so this will actually play the sound when our scene starts. We also want to make sure that the sound is constantly playing all the time in the background, so we want to have it on loop. And if I test this out, I should be able to hear the crackling fire in my scene in VR. So now we can hear our fireplace in the background, but we do have a small issue here that the fireplace is always the same sound no matter how far I'm standing from the actual fireplace. So we want to set it up so that we can actually hear the fireplace at different levels in different parts of the room, but also so that we can hear it in our left and right ears using 3D audio. Okay. So right now our audio is set to be 2D spatially. Now what that means is if you were listening to music through headphones, for example, the audio would sound the same no matter where you're moving in your room because you have those headphones on. If we change spatial blend to 3D, this is how sound would normally work in the real world when you're standing outside, for example. So if you hear a car horn, for example, it will sound different the closer or farther away you're standing from that car, but also you'll be able to hear which direction the sound is coming from, something that we can't do with 2D audio. So 3D audio is especially helpful when we're in this VR world, because if I'm standing by the chest, the sound should be quieter versus next to the fireplace. But also if I'm turning my head, I want to know which direction the sound is coming from. You could adjust some other settings as well if you want to change the actual sound from the volume to the pitch. You can even change other things like the spread of the sound, how it disperses around the object. You can change things like the roll-off if you want it to have a different sound signature as you're farther away from it. So right now it's set to logarithmic roll-off, which is basically how sound works in the real world. You could change it to something like linear, or if you wanted to make your own a custom roll-off. Linear is just as you step away from the sound source, the audio level will constantly change over time, which isn't really how sound works. You can even change minimum and maximum distances if you wanted to. Something that's also cool is there's a Doppler level that you could select. So for example, with a moving car, as it's moving towards you, has a different sound than when it's moving away. And so you can actually create that effect using 3D sound. So a lot of different things that you can play with, but let's just make sure that the fireplace sounds quieter when it's farther away from us versus when we're right next to it. So now with 3D audio, I can hear the fireplace only in my left ear, but if I turn towards the fireplace, now I can hear it in both ears. Another cool thing about spatial audio is as I get closer, now the fireplace is much louder when I'm closer to it versus when I'm farther away. So by adding 3D audio, we can add a lot of life to our scene. So you may have noticed that the audio was just a little too loud on that fireplace, so I'm going to change the volume. So on my fire particle in the audio source, you can see there's a volume setting there. So I'm going to set this to about half. You could probably adjust this a bit more if you wanted to, if you want it to be quieter, or maybe you want it louder. And that's all you really need to do, so the next time you start up your project, it'll be a little quieter. So what you're going to do is, in your scene, you're going to about half. You could probably adjust this a bit more if you wanted to, if you want it to be quieter, or maybe you want it louder. And that's all you really need to do, so the next time you start up your project, it'll be a little quieter. So what you're going to do is, in your scene, you're going to select your fireplace, and you're going to go to the fire particle, because that's where you want the sound to originate from. On that fire particle, you're going to add a component for an audio source.
Reverberancia, creo que significa esto.
So now we can hear that fire roaring in the background, and it's set up spatially so that now I can hear it in both ears, but if I turn my head, now it's only really in my right ear. If I turn to my right, it's more in my left ear. However, something cool that we can do is recreate the acoustics of this room so that it sounds like we're actually in an enclosed room where the sound is bouncing off of all these walls. And so we're gonna get set up with reverb zones. Now, reverb zones might be a new concept to you, but if you think about how different rooms sound, that's basically the effect of a reverb zone. So, for example, if you're in an auditorium versus your own room, or in a cave or outside, in a forest, all of these different spaces have different kinds of sound and the way that they affect sound. So if you watch a recording of some music, they'll be in like a really padded room where there's not a lot of sound bouncing around, which is why they have all the padded walls and stuff. Versus something like an opera house where the chamber is really large and really open, so it allows for very spacey, open sound happening. So the way we're gonna do that is by adding in a special object called a reverb zone to create that effect.
Okay.
In order to do that, I'm gonna select the room object that I have. So it's in my static objects here, and let's see, room modern. Now inside of my room object, I'm just going to right click on it, go down to the audio option, and create an audio reverb zone as a child. Now, if I zoom out, you can actually see the effect of this reverb zone. So it's actually pretty large. There are two different spheres here. If you can't actually see this reverb zone, you might have your gizmos disabled. So if you go to the top of the scene view here, you can just click on the word gizmos. It'll disable all of your different gizmos. If you click it again, you should see all of your different gizmos. Now, the two spheres that we see here are the minimum and maximum distance of this reverb zone effect. So anything within the minimum distance is always going to have the full effect of any audio reverberation that you set. Anything within this minimum and maximum distance between these two spheres, the effect will slowly start transitioning out until you get outside of the sphere, where there will be no reverb, essentially. So that's kind of helpful if you're going through two different environments or zones. You want to use the minimum and maximum distance to create that sound shift. For now, the only thing we need to do is make sure that our minimum distance is the size of our room here, since we're not even venturing outside of it anyways. So I can actually just drag the minimum distance down to be about the size of the room. You can also see there are these little handles which you can use on the sphere to change that size as well. So let's just make it a little bit bigger than the room. That seems about fine for there. Now, if I test out my scene in play mode, we can hear the effect of that reverb zone. So you can actually hear that fireplace and it's roaring in the background. Let me actually move my XR rig here. So that way we can hear it in both our left and right ear. Something about there or so. Just move it a little bit farther away so it's a little quieter. That sounds fine. Now in our audio reverb zone in our scene, I can change the reverb preset. So right now it's set to generic. If I change this to off, you can see that the sound becomes a little bit more flat. It doesn't really have that roominess to it. I can even try some different settings so we could see what an auditorium sounds like. There's a little bit more echo, maybe a cave. Ooh, you can really hear the sound bouncing off in that cave. What does a stone corridor sound like? So you can kind of hear the sound of it bouncing off of like those stone walls in a way. You can kind of imagine it. Let's see what a forest sounds like. You can hear that the sound here is a lot more open and it's kind of like expanding out through those trees. So if we try our preset for living room here, this is kind of how we want it to sound like. We could probably bring down the noise level just a little bit, the sound level for our fireplace. But now you can hear that the sound is a lot more contained. And that's kind of the effect that we're going for. If you really wanted to, you could create your own effect by selecting user as the reverb preset. It's a little bit more complex than what we're going to cover in this course here. Goes a lot into audio theory and all of these different audio settings, but if you wanted to, you could change those around if you want and play around with it. But we'll go back to living room and leave it there for now. So what you're gonna do is in your project, you're gonna go to where your room object is stored. So in my case, I put it in that static header. With room modern selected, you're going to right click on it and create an audio reverb zone. Once you do that, it'll add the audio reverb zone as a child of that room object. So you can select that, and then with it selected, make sure your gizmos are turned on. If not, just click the gizmos button at the top, and you should see these two blue spheres here. And all you're gonna do is change the minimum distance down to be the size of the room here. While our current 3D audio works perfectly fine on our fireplace here, we can install additional libraries from our headset providers to make that audio spatialization even better. Now, this is something particularly important if you have a lot of audio in your scene that you want to affect, but is something that's entirely optional to add. So let's take a look at the audio library available through the Oculus Quest. Now you can see here that Oculus provides its own spatializer library just for Unity. And I can go ahead and download this from the website if I wanted to. Essentially what would happen is I get a folder that I unzip that has a Unity package for Oculus audio spatialization. Now this audio spatializer plugin is really helpful if you want to level up your audio even more. Essentially inside of the spatializer plugin are a bunch of audio libraries to help make your audio experience feel even more real inside of VR. If I click on the documentation, you'll see that there are a whole list of different features that they've added into this specific library. And different headset providers may occasionally have their own libraries that you can add into your projects as well. Just to really quickly show you how I would set this up for the Oculus Quest, I'm gonna go to Edit, Project Settings, and then under the Audio window, you'll see there's an option for Spatializer Plugin, and for me, if I click the dropdown, it says Oculus Spatializer. Now, I've already imported that Oculus package into my project. So if I head over to my fireplace and go to the particle fire, you'll see that there are two new options underneath my audio source for spatialize and spatialize post effects. If you download a different plugin from a different headset provider, you might see something different here. Another thing that I can also add into this object is something called an ONSP audio source. And you can see here there's actually a bunch of different audio components that I could add if I wanted to. So if I add this audio source, you can see that there are even more options for me to get really, really dialed in with my spatialized audio. So the benefit of this is that it does a really good job of recreating audio in an open space. So for example, I could have it reflect off of surfaces, I could increase the gain, I can change the range specifically through this component, as well as the radius, and even affect the reverb of my audio. So the nice thing about adding in these different plugins is that your audio then becomes a little bit more clear, a little bit more precise when you're in the 3D world. Now, if you want to check this out yourself, we have a list of links for some of the additional audio plugins available through other headset providers in the instructions below. I highly recommend you check out the links and the documentation for those different plugins to see how they work for your project. So what you're going to do if you want to proceed with this step, check out the links below in the instructions to see how you'd add in these different plugins to your project. And now it's your turn.
Ya, 40 minutos, wow. ¿Cómo sabe el tiempo?
All right, congratulations on making it to the end of this section. So we've added in a lot of different features into our project. So I can hover over this tennis racket here and my controller has a little vibration. But then when I pick up the tennis racket, it makes a noise and my controller vibrates as well. So that's pretty cool. And we can do that with other objects in our scene here. Now, something else that we've added in is some cool 3D audio. So as I get closer to the fireplace here, you can see that now it's making a much louder sound. And if I stand next to it, it's way louder. Versus if I'm on the opposite side of the room, and it's much quieter. So we've learned a lot of important concepts in this section, from haptics and audio feedback to help our users, but also learned a lot about spatial audio to make our environment feel more alive, as well as added in a reverb zone, so now our room performs a lot more acoustically like it would in the real world. Now in our next lesson, we'll work a bit more on some interactable objects that we can actually control our TV.
Okay. Extension. Oh. Me quiero ir a dormir, no lo quiero, pero lo vamos a intentar. Add a speaker into the room to play music. ¿Dónde? Ah, ahí en el fondo podría ponerlo. A ver. Debería haber algún prefab para eso. Objects. Electronics. Ahí queda la música. Aquí está. Oh, están separados. Puedo rotar de manera independiente y nítida. Recuerdo que tenía un rotate itself, este era. Vamos a ver si rota. Pero lento. Muy rápido. ¿A qué velocidad rota usualmente un vinilo? Con surco polar. 33 revoluciones por minuto, eso serían 2 segundos. 1. Ah, no, entonces estaba bien en 180. A ver. Entonces estaba bien. Esa es la velocidad en la que tiene que rotar. Un poquito menos. 90 más 45. 35 me gusta. Que rote así, 35. Ese rotate itself ya lo tenía hecho yo antes. Perfecto. Hay que ponerle música, ¿verdad? Entonces lo ponemos al... Flatter, handle, base. Source, play on awake. ¿Y qué música tenemos acá? Música. Era en audio. Cerramos este. Ese. Que haga loop. El volumen lo vamos a dejar en 175 y blend en 3. Para que se escuche. Dos metros está bien. Vamos a ver. Nítido, se escucha en el fondo. Y ahora se escucha lejos. Ajá. ¿Qué dice? Nuevamente que uses. Ah, se fue en 1080. Bueno, ni modo. Que se vaya. Check a the speaker. Add realistic bouncing sounds. No creo que tenga algo de bounce. Change based on the speed of its moving for using rigid body velocity magnitude. Tennis ball bounce sound.
When you're ready. When you're ready.
Algo más corto. Este es. Course library samples send. Create new folder. Tengo audio. Y vamos a mandar el tenis ball. A ver. You may want to dolor, ya lo tengo, tenis ball. Ay, parece que lo puedo renombrar. Renombrémoslo. ¿Cómo es que tienen renombrados aquí los audios? SFX Tennis Ball Bounce, así lo vamos a llamar. Add a 3D audio source to the ball. Donde tengo la ball, interactables, tennis ball ring. Audio source. Está bien. La pelota, ¿dónde es que la tengo? Es parte de Sports. Object Sports. Folder. the source no se reproduce. Ah, no. Make it true. No hay que reproducirlo aquí y le vamos a poner su sonido. ¿Dónde estaba? Audio. Ya está hasta arriba. Pero no hay que reproducirlo. Okay. Un collision enter. Play one shot, que es. Ah, ok. Ya tiene su propio click. Oh, ok. Es en cualquier colisión. Pero Play One Shot tiene dos parámetros. Oh, el volume scale. Vamos a crear. Según las instrucciones debo utilizar velocity magnitude. Cloud volume collision relative velocity magnitude. ¿Está bien esto? ¿Está bien eso? Hago esto. Solo por si acaso quiero saber cuánto es el volumen, no estoy seguro. Bueno, nada perdemos comprobar. Veamos. 1% de ese volumen. Esto por 0.1. A ver ahora. Cargando. Ok. ¡Ay, no! ¡Se cayó! Quiero bañar un ratito primero. Ahorita vengo, solo necesito ir al baño. ahí por hoy. Ya se lo tengo que hacer. No, no puedo quedarme solo así. ¿Qué es eso? Rígido el borde. Un poquito más lógico. Spatial Lens debería estar en 3D. A ver si mejora el sonido ahora. ¿Por qué es tan exagerado el sonido? Huelen los oídos. Sí, tengo que ponerle un máximo de volumen. Video 100, simplemente video 100. Y ya. Pues aquí. escuche más, pero necesito modificar el máximo del audio. Creo que tiene que haber un máximo, tal vez un máximo de 1. Tal vez en una escala logarítmica. Tamaño. Podría ser. Hasta donde quería. Nítido. Estuvo bueno. Activation events. Users will be able to pick up a remote and press a button and control it to turn on TV. Oh, ok, eso es nuevo. Pero eso lo dejamos para mañana. Me despido por hoy.